The silence can be the heaviest thing. Can't it? That deep, expectant hush right before the floorboards creak, or the phone rings from an unknown number. Tonight, we're going to sit with that silence and see what it invites in. We've gathered a collection of tales, not of monsters under the bed, but of the unsettling whispers in the walls, the cold dread that settles in when you realize you're not as alone as you thought. These are stories that linger long after the screen goes dark. So, find your quietest corner, turn off the lights, and if you have them, put on your headphones. Let's see what's waiting for us in the dark. The 4-pole in room 213 was still dripping, a slow, rhythmic plink against the silent plastic basin, even though the room had been empty since just after midnight. I was on my usual graveyard shift at St. Jude's, a small community hospital that usually meant more boredom than actual work after the doctors made their evening rounds. I'd been a CNA there for almost 2 years, mostly covering the quiet medical surgical floor, and I thought I'd seen everything a hospital could throw at you. Usually, the worst part of my night was the lukewarm coffee from the break room or the sudden loud alarm from a confused elderly patient's bed sensor. That night, however, was different. The silence felt heavier. It was just me and Brenda, the charge nurse, on the floor. Brenda was in her office, probably catching up on charting, while I was supposed to be doing my rounds. The unit was eerily quiet, even for 3 a.m. No call bells, no distant beeps from machines, just the low hum of the fluorescent lights. I had already checked on Mrs. Henderson in 207, who was sleeping peacefully, and Mr. Davies in 209, who was watching an old movie on his tablet with his headphones on. Everything was routine, everything was normal, except for that dripping 4 in 213, a room that should have been prepped for the next admission, stripped down and sanitized. It was a minor detail, but it bugged me. Our patient, Mr. Silas, had been discharged around 12:30 a.m. He was a sweet old man, admitted for observation after a fall, and he'd been eager to get home. I'd helped him pack his small bag, made sure he had his cane, and watched him walk out with his daughter. He was a bit unsteady, but he was definitely walking. When I passed room 213 again, the door was slightly ajar. I glanced in. The bed was still made, sheets pulled tight, a hospital gown folded neatly on the pillow. That was odd. Usually, housekeeping came up to strip the room almost immediately after discharge, especially on a quiet night. It wasn't my job, but I decided to just strip the bed myself. I pushed the door open completely and stepped inside. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the hall. The 4-pole was indeed still dripping, a steady, irritating sound in the stillness. I walked over to it, about to clamp the line, when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible ringing sound. It wasn't my pager, and Brenda hadn't paged me. It sounded like a call light. My eyes scanned the room. The bed was empty, the sheets undisturbed. No patient, no one to be pressing the call button. I walked closer to the bed, thinking maybe it was a faulty sensor, but the call light box, usually clipped to the patient's gown or pillow, was lying on the bedside table, unclipped. Yet, the soft, persistent ring continued. The sound seemed to be coming from the bedside table itself, near the call light. I hesitated for a moment, a prickle of unease starting to spread. It was ridiculous. There was no one here. It had to be an electrical short or some kind of interference. I reached for the call light box, intending to unplug it from the wall, but as my fingers brushed against the plastic, the ringing stopped abruptly. Just like that. Silence. I pulled my hand back, feeling foolish. It was just a broken piece of equipment. I took a deep breath, trying to dismiss the sudden chill I felt. I told myself to focus on the task at hand, stripping the bed and then finding housekeeping to deal with this faulty call light. I went to the foot of the bed and started pulling back the top sheet. It was crisp and clean, just as it should be. Then I reached the fitted sheet. As I started to tug it free from the mattress, My hand brushed against something cold and damp near the middle of the bed. I paused, frowning. Damp? I pulled the sheet back further. There, right where a patient's lower back would have been, was a dark, wet stain on the mattress cover. It wasn't a large stain, maybe the size of my palm, but it was distinctly wet and cold. My stomach clenched. Mr. Silas hadn't had any issues with incontinence. He was perfectly mobile, perfectly lucid. This didn't make any sense at all. I stared at the damp spot, my mind racing through possibilities. Had housekeeping already been in here, spilled something, and forgotten to change the mattress protector? But the sheets were still perfectly made, and the call light was ringing. A cold knot formed in my chest. I felt a sudden, distinct drop in temperature in the room, like someone had opened a freezer door. Then, a shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just a chill. It felt like something had just brushed past me. A phantom touch. I spun around, my heart hammering, expecting to see Brenda or even a janitor, but the room was empty. Completely empty. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then I heard it again. Faint, but distinct. Footsteps. Slow, shuffling footsteps. Coming from the hallway outside room 213. They sounded like someone who was struggling to walk, like an elderly person perhaps, dragging their feet. My first thought was that a patient had gotten out of bed and was wandering. But all the bed alarms were set, and none had gone off. And these footsteps were too quiet, too deliberate. They passed the open door of room 213, moving slowly down the hall, away from me, in the direction of the nurse's station. I peered out, my head craning, but the hallway was a long, dark stretch of emptiness. No one was there. I stood frozen, listening to the fading, dragging footsteps. They stopped. Silence again. My mind screamed at me to get out, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. I looked back at the bed, at the wet spot on the mattress, then at the call light box on the table. And as I watched, the call light button, the one that had been ringing before, slowly, deliberately, began to glow again. A soft, pulsing orange. It wasn't ringing this time, just glowing, as if someone had just pressed it and was holding it down. I didn't wait. I turned and practically ran out of room 213, not stopping until I was safely behind the nurse's station, Brenda looking at me with a questioning frown. I mumbled something about a faulty call light in 213 and the cold, and Brenda, bless her heart, just nodded, probably used to my weird night shift stories. I made her call housekeeping to strip the room, explaining the spill I'd found. I never went back into room 213 alone that night. I heard later that the room stayed empty for a few weeks, and when they finally put a new patient in there, the call light started ringing randomly, even when unplugged. They eventually had to replace the entire system. I try to be rational, but I can't shake the image of that glowing button, and the feeling that something had walked out of that room. Or maybe, something had walked back in after Mr. Silas left, and it was still waiting for someone to answer its call. Sometimes, the most unsettling things are those left behind, the echoes in a vacant space. You might think you've closed the door on one fear, only to find another waiting just outside the frame. A new voice, a new presence, insisting on being heard. The phone on the empty nursing station desk rang. A low, persistent buzz that cut through the oppressive quiet of the night shift. It was 3 a.m. exactly, and I was the only one on my feet on the entire floor. I just stepped out of the break room, clutching a lukewarm coffee, thinking I had a few more minutes of peace before my rounds. We only had a handful of long-term care patients in this wing, mostly elderly folks with dementia, so a ringing phone in the middle of the night usually meant a confused patient trying to order breakfast or worse, a genuine emergency. But this particular sound felt different, a little too insistent for a misdial and a little too calm for a crisis. It was just a steady, almost polite ring. I braced myself for whatever was on the other end. "My name is Sarah," And at 23, I was still relatively new to working third shift at St. Jude's long-term care facility. Most of the other nurses preferred day shifts, but I liked the quiet. It gave me time to study for my advanced nursing degree online between rounds. The pay was better too, and the residents, despite their various conditions, were mostly sweet. It was usually just checking vitals, administering medications, and helping with nightly routines. On a typical night, after 1 a.m., the only sounds were the distant hum of the ventilation system and the occasional creak of the old building settling. Tonight, however, the silence was broken, not just by the phone, but by a certain heavy quality in the air, a stillness that felt almost watchful. I walked over to the desk, my rubber soles making almost no sound on the polished linoleum. The caller ID glowed, room 12. That was Mr. Henderson's room. He was 92, mostly lucid during the day, but often restless and disoriented at night. He'd occasionally call the station if he couldn't sleep, asking for a glass of water or just to chat. I picked up the receiver. "Good morning, Mr. Henderson. This is Sarah. Everything all right?" There was a pause on the other end, a kind of dead air, then a soft, raspy inhale. I waited, assuming he was gathering his thoughts, perhaps trying to remember why he'd called. The silence stretched, becoming less like a pause and more like a deliberate void. I could almost hear the faint hum of his room's air conditioning through the phone. Then, a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. "Hello?" It breathed. Not Mr. Henderson's usual slightly booming, if confused, voice. This was lower, drier, like rustling leaves. "Mr. Henderson?" I asked again, a little louder, my brow furrowing. "Is everything okay? Do you need something?" Another long pause, then the whisper again, closer this time and clearer. I need to get out." My heart gave a little thump. This wasn't like Mr. Henderson at all. He loved his room, his little window overlooking the small garden. He always said it reminded him of his own backyard. The tone of the whisper was what really got to me. It wasn't confused. It sounded trapped. A shiver traced its way down my spine despite the warm hospital air. I clutched the receiver tighter, my knuckles white. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was having a particularly bad night, a nightmare perhaps, and was just trying to wake himself up. The elderly sometimes revert to old memories, old fears. Maybe he thought he was back in his childhood home, trying to escape a perceived threat. I told myself to stay calm. "Mr. Henderson, you're safe in your room. Is there anything I can do for you? Can I come check on you?" The line went quiet again, even the raspy breathing gone. It was like talking to an empty room, yet I knew he was still there. That stillness, that absence of sound, was more unsettling than any noise could have been. It made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I took a deep, shaky breath, trying to steady my nerves. I decided I needed to see him to make sure he was all right. I hung up the phone, grabbed my flashlight, and started walking down the silent hallway toward room 12. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer. Every distant creak sounded amplified. When I reached his door, it was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible. I pushed it open gently. "Mr. Henderson?" I whispered, shining my flashlight around the dim room. The bed was neatly made, the sheets pulled up, but empty. The covers hadn't even been disturbed. My breath hitched in my throat. I flashed the light around the small bathroom, checked behind the curtains. Nothing. He wasn't in his room. A cold dread began to creep through me, heavier than any fatigue. I backed out of the room, heart pounding against my ribs, and immediately called security on my radio, my voice a little shaky. "I have a missing patient, Mr. Henderson from room 12. As I waited for a response, I peered down the long, deserted hallway. The emergency exit door at the far end, usually locked and alarmed, looked like it was a hair ajar, just enough to show a sliver of the darker corridor beyond. My eyes narrowed. Had he somehow managed to get out? My radio crackled. "Sarah, this is Ted. Mr. Henderson?" But he was discharged this morning. His family picked him up around 10. The words hit me like a physical blow, cold and disorienting. Discharged? This morning? My mind reeled. He couldn't have called me if he wasn't here. I rushed back to the nursing station, my flashlight beam bouncing erratically. I pulled up the patient register on the computer. Room 12 vacant. Discharged. Date. Today's date. Time. 10:17 a.m. My blood ran cold. If Mr. Henderson wasn't here, who had called me? And who had been in his room? The thought was a sickening twist in my stomach. I remembered the whisper. "I need to get out." It wasn't a plea for help. It was a statement of fact, maybe even a warning. I looked at the empty phone on the desk, the soft glow of the caller ID still displaying room 12. My hand instinctively reached for the receiver, but then I stopped myself. What if it rang again? What if I picked it up and heard that whisper? Knowing the room was empty, security arrived a few minutes later. 2 burly men who looked confused when I explained. We checked the room again, confirming it was indeed empty and had been for hours. They checked the exit doors, all secured. The phone logs showed an internal call from room 12 at 3 a.m., just as I'd seen. There was no explanation. I finished my shift in a daze, watching the sun come up over the hospital parking lot, its light doing little to dispel the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I never worked another night shift in that wing. Even now, sometimes, in the dead of night, I wonder if the phone in room 12 still rings, and if the empty bed still waits for a voice to call out from it. And who or what answers? The weight of what we carry, the unseen burdens that press down on us, can be the most suffocating horror of all. It's the feeling that something is pressing in, something you can't quite see, but you can certainly feel its cold presence. The 4 drip in room 4 was still running, even though Mrs. Peterson had been discharged over an hour ago. I'd seen a lot of weird things working the night shift at St. Jude's, but finding an active 4 line in an empty room after discharge wasn't just unusual. It was a glaring oversight. I was only 22, fresh out of nursing school, and this was my first solo graveyard shift. The hospital was a labyrinth of hushed halls and flickering fluorescent lights after midnight, every shadow seeming a little too deep, every distant sound a little too close. I was assigned to the pediatric ward, which was usually quiet at night, mostly sleeping children recovering from tonsillectomies or minor surgeries. Tonight, though, felt different. A heavy, almost oppressive silence hung in the air, a silence that hummed with something unseen. My job was mostly monitoring vitals, administering meds, and answering the occasional call light. The pediatric ward on the 3rd floor had 8 rooms, but only 2 were occupied tonight. Room 1 had a little boy with a broken arm, and room 7 had a teenager recovering from an appendectomy. Rooms 2, 3, 5, 6, and 8 were all dark and empty. Room 4, where Mrs. Peterson had been recovering from a minor infection, should have been empty too. But as I walked past it on my initial rounds, I noticed the door was slightly ajar, and the pale blue light of a functioning 4-pump cast a faint glow into the hall. My stomach did a little flip. I pushed the door open just enough to confirm it. The bed was stripped, the mattress bare, but the pole stood there, beeping softly, delivering saline into thin air. I walked in, my rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the linoleum. The room was cold, much colder than the rest of the ward. I reached for the 4-pump, meaning to turn it off when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound, like breathing. It wasn't coming from the empty bed. It was coming from the small, built-in window seat under the main window. It was a space usually used by parents staying overnight, a thin mattress covered with a sheet. My heart started to pick up. I knew for a fact no one was supposed to be in this room. Mrs. Peterson was gone. No new admissions. I stood frozen for a moment, listening, trying to rationalize it away. Maybe a faulty ventilation system? An old building settling? But the sound was too distinct, too organic. It was a soft, shallow inhalation, followed by an even softer exhalation. My flashlight beam, which I always carried on my rounds, felt heavy in my hand. I aimed it at the window seat. There was a blanket, folded haphazardly, partially covering something. The breathing continued, steady and low. It was impossible. My mind raced through scenarios. A lost child, a homeless person who'd snuck in, a doctor catching a quick nap. None of them made sense. My shift partner, Gary, was on the other end of the floor, probably reading or on his phone. I was alone here. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and took a step closer to the window seat. The air grew colder, and a faint, almost metallic smell, like old blood mixed with disinfectant, seemed to emanate from the blanket. My hand trembled slightly as I reached out. My fingers brushed the rough wool of the blanket. Felt heavy, unnaturally heavy, like there was a significant weight underneath it, not just a folded sheet. The breathing suddenly paused. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with unspoken dread. My hand froze, hovering over the blanket. Every nerve ending screamed at me to run, to call Gary, to do anything but stand there in that freezing room. But I was stuck, paralyzed by a morbid curiosity and the rules of my job. What if it was a patient in distress? What if I walked away and someone needed help? The internal conflict was agonizing. I swallowed hard, the sound loud in my ears. I knew, deep down, that whatever was under that blanket was not a patient. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I pulled the blanket back. My eyes, already accustomed to the dim light, strained to see. There was nothing there. Absolutely nothing. The window seat was bare. The thin mattress was visible, slightly indented, as if something had been lying on it, but completely empty. The breathing had stopped the moment I touched the blanket, and now the silence was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the hospital. I stared, dumbfounded, at the empty space. My rational brain tried to kick in. I was tired. I was imagining things. The sounds were from outside. The cold was just a draft. But the cold was still there. A sharp, penetrating chill that seeped into my bones, and the metallic smell lingered, faint but undeniable. I reached out and touched the mattress on the window seat. It was undeniably cool, but felt just like any other hospital mattress. However, where the blanket had been, there was a clear, shallow indentation, like something heavy had been resting there for a long time. It wasn't the uniform depression of someone just getting up. It was distinct, almost like the impression of a torso and head. My flashlight beam danced over it, highlighting the subtle curve. I stood there, staring at the visible evidence of something that wasn't there, and a profound sense of wrongness settled over me. It felt like I had just interrupted something, disturbed a presence that had been quietly existing in that empty room, and it had simply vanished. I backed out of the room slowly, my hands still gripping the flashlight, my eyes fixed on the empty window seat. The 4-pump was still beeping, a mundane sound in a deeply unsettling moment. I finally reached out and pressed the off button, silencing its rhythmic pulse. As I turned to leave, the call light for room 7 suddenly lit up, a bright red beacon piercing the dimness of the hallway. It was the teenager recovering from appendectomy. I practically sprinted to his room, grateful for the distraction, the sudden need to be useful, to be anywhere but room 4. When I got there, the kid just wanted more ice chips. I gave them to him, my hands still shaking slightly, my mind replaying the empty indentation, the breathing that wasn't, the blanket that covered nothing. I didn't tell Gary about it. What was I going to say? That I heard breathing in an empty room and saw an indentation where no one was? He'd think I was crazy or just exhausted. For the rest of my shift, I avoided walking past room 4. I took the long way around, using the fire exit stairs to get to the other side of the floor. Each time I thought about it, a shiver went down my spine. When I finally clocked out that morning, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. But even in the daylight, even on the drive home, I could still feel the phantom chill of room 4 and the disturbing weight of the silence after the breathing stopped. Some things you can't rationalize away no matter how hard you try. You think you've escaped, that the connection has been severed. But some calls, some signals have a way of finding you no matter how far you run. The line might seem dead, but someone or something is always listening on the other end. The silence was what first got to me, even before the light started flickering. Midnight in a hospital is never truly silent, not even on the quietest floor. There's always the distant hum of machines, the muted clatter from the ER down below, or the soft murmur of nurses at the station. But this particular night, working my usual 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift as a night nurse, the third floor was like a tomb. It was unsettling. I was doing my rounds, checking on patients, and the only sound was the squeak of my shoes on the linoleum, which seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the empty corridor. My usual routine felt off, the air thick with an almost palpable stillness that made the hairs on my arms stand up. My name is Sarah, and I've been a registered nurse for about 5 years now, 2 of those on the night shift in this hospital. You learn to tune out a lot of things, to rationalize the strange noises and shadows that come with working in a place where life and death are a daily occurrence. I was passing room 307, which had been empty for 3 days since old Mrs. Henderson finally passed. The door was slightly ajar, which was odd. We usually keep unoccupied rooms securely shut. I pushed it open gently, planning to close it properly. The window was open, just a crack, letting in a cool breeze that ruffled the thin curtains. I thought, someone must have forgotten to close it after cleaning. Just a simple oversight, nothing more. I stepped into the room, intending to just close the window and the door. The air was colder in there, a damp chill that felt out of place for late summer. The curtains, thin and white, swayed gently, almost rhythmically, even though the window was only open a sliver. It was enough to make them move, I told myself. A draft, that's all. The bed in the center was stripped clean, the mattress bare. It looked stark and lonely under the weak overhead light. I walked over to the window, feeling a peculiar heaviness in the room, like the air itself was pressing down on me. I reached out to push the window shut, but hesitated for a moment, an unshakable feeling making me pause. That's when I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was so soft I wasn't sure if it was real or just the wind playing tricks, or maybe my own imagination, heightened by the unsettling silence of the floor. It sounded like a sigh, followed by what could have been a word, or just a breath. It was indistinct, but it seemed to come from the direction of the bed. I spun around, my heart giving a little jump. Nothing. The empty bed, the swaying curtains, the shadows clinging to the corners of the room. I stood there, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. My rational mind kicked in. Sarah, you're tired. It's 3 a.m. Go close the window and get back to work. I forced myself to calm down, took a deep breath, and finally pushed the window down and locked it. The curtains stilled. As I turned to leave, I glanced at the empty bed again. And that's when I saw it. The sheets. They weren't stripped clean, not entirely. There was a faint indentation on the pillow, like someone had just rested their head there. And the top sheet, which I was certain had been folded neatly at the foot of the bed earlier in the day, was now rumpled, slightly pulled up, as if someone had just gotten out of it. My breath hitched. This room had been empty and sealed for 3 days. No one should have been in here, A cold dread started to spread through me, replacing the logical explanations. I backed out of the room slowly, my eyes still fixed on the rumpled sheet, pulling the door shut behind me with a soft click. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening, my ears straining for any sound. That's when I heard it again. Not a whisper this time, but a faint shuffling sound, like bare feet dragging on the linoleum. It was coming from deeper down the hall, past the nurse's station, towards the patient rooms. My first thought was a confused patient, but all my patients were accounted for, and most were bedridden or under heavy sedation. My stomach clenched. I grabbed my flashlight from my cart, a small, heavy beam of light in the overwhelming darkness. I started walking, slowly, towards the sound, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. With every step, the shuffling sound grew a little clearer. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of someone moving with difficulty. I called out softly, "Hello? Is someone out of bed?" No answer, just the continued drag of feet. As I rounded the corner, past the nurse's station, my flashlight beam landed on a figure. It was an elderly woman, dressed in a thin hospital gown, her back to me. Her hair was wispy, almost white, and she was moving with a pronounced limp, her body hunched. She was heading away from me, towards the far end of the hall, towards the closed-off wing where no one was supposed to be. My mind immediately started flipping through my patient roster. There was no one matching her description on this floor tonight. No one who should be walking around like that. I called out again, louder this time. "Ma'am, do you need help? What room are you in?" She didn't respond, just kept shuffling. A little faster now, her shadow stretching long and distorted in the weak emergency lights. I started to quicken my pace, needing to get to her, to guide her back to her room before she hurt herself. As I got closer, her gown caught the light differently, and I noticed something odd. It wasn't the standard hospital issue. It was old-fashioned, made of a thicker, almost flannel-like material, and it had small, delicate lace trim around the collar. Our gowns definitely didn't have lace. I was only a few feet behind her when she finally stopped. She stood directly in front of room 307, the very room I had just left. The room with the open window and the rumpled sheets. My blood ran cold. She slowly turned, and my flashlight beam fell on her face. Her eyes were milky and unfocused, her skin paper-thin and pale. She had a strange, almost serene smile on her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. And pinned to her gown, right where a patient's ID band would be, was a small, tarnished silver locket. My breath hitched. I remembered old Mrs. Henderson, who had occupied room 307 for her final weeks. She had always worn a distinctive silver locket. Always. It was the last thing her family mentioned when they cleared her belongings. The woman looked at me, and her smile widened just a fraction. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she raised a hand and pointed a long, bony finger at the door of room 307. Her lips parted, and a raspy whisper escaped them. "I just needed to stretch my legs, dear, but I think it's time to get back into bed now." The voice was ancient, fragile but clear. Then, she turned, pushed open the door to room 307, and limped inside. I stood there, frozen, my flashlight beam shaking. I heard the soft click of the door closing. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. When I finally dared to approach the door, it was shut tight. I slowly turned the handle. Locked. From the inside. I stood there, my hands still on the cold metal, my blood chilling in my veins. The patient who shouldn't be walking had just gotten back into the empty bed. I didn't open that door again. Not that night, not ever. I finished my shift in a daze, checking the other rooms, but the chill of room 307 lingered. When the morning shift came, I told them about the incident with the open window and the rumpled bed, omitting the part about the old woman. They just nodded, attributing it to a sleepy night nurse. But I know what I saw and I know what I heard. To this day, when I pass room 307 on my rounds, I always feel a colder spot in the hallway, and sometimes, if I listen very closely in the dead of night, I can hear a faint, almost imperceptible sigh from behind the closed door. It's a quiet reminder that some patients never truly leave. These stories, they linger, don't they? Not because of jump scares or grotesque images, but because they tap into the quiet, everyday fears we all try to ignore. The fear that the mundane can turn sinister, that the comfort of home can become a cage, or that the world around us holds secrets we were never meant to uncover. It's the feeling that what happened to them could just as easily happen to you. If you want more stories that stay with you, join Scareverse for a new tale every week.